This is very much a work in progress. It's still a very early draft. I'm hoping to work on it substantially over the summer, and that's why you workshop these things, so you can get the feedback. There are sections yet to be written. There are sections that badly need to be rewritten. There are sections that need to be unwritten. There's much more research and thinking to be done. All of my conclusions are tentative, even the ones, perhaps even especially the ones that I assert with undue confidence. I've changed my mind on some issues several times already. So with that caveat, let me just briefly summarize the themes, because I think the essential theses are there. And the basic theme, closer. Okay. The basic theme is that you can look at war powers through sort of the back door of thinking about who has the power to declare peace. There is a declare war clause in the Constitution, but there is not a specific declare peace clause. And my working hypothesis is that the peace power is a shared power, divided power that arises as an incidental consequence of the division of war powers, and that each branch has certain peace powers, powers with which to effectuate peace, and that there are overlapping, intersecting peace powers, and it's just sort of a tour through the Constitution's peace powers, divided roughly between presidential peace powers and congressional peace powers. The bulk of what is here in the draft for the convention, for the conference, is focused on the presidential peace powers, and I think there are basically four of them. Okay, there's the treaty power, the executive agreement power, the commander-in-chief power, and then kind of a composite power. And let me just say a few words about each. The power to end war by peace treaty is kind of the paradigmatic way of ending a war, right? It's a traditional understanding that a treaty of peace annuls and supersedes the legal condition of war. And I use that as sort of the baseline. So a peace treaty terminates the legal force of a war declaration. Now, everybody agrees with that, but it's sort of interesting to think about why that it might be true. And I think the core reason why it is true is because of treaties' status as supreme law of the land under Article 6. That because a treaty can form part of the supreme law of the land, and is of equivalent legal stature to a congressional enactment, a statute, a later in time treaty can supersede a prior war declaration. And I think that becomes important as a baseline for thinking about other types of executive peace powers. The second example that I spend a lot of time discussing is executive agreements of peace. It does not require a treaty for the president to make peace. The president has the general foreign affairs power as a matter of the vesting clause of the executive power. The executive power includes the power over foreign affairs except where specific exceptions are made in favor of congressional powers or shared powers. The treaty power is a power that is a limitation on the foreign affairs power, specifically that if you are going to use the foreign affairs power to make domestic law, you must have the president make the treaty and get the concurrency, advice, and consent of 2/3 of the Senate. But the treaty power is not a limitation on the ability of the president through the general executive power over foreign affairs to make non-treaty executive agreements. The crucial distinction is that a non-treaty executive agreement, though within the constitutional power of the president to make, does not have the force of Article 6 supreme law. So an executive agreement making peace or ending a war does not have the same legal effect as a treaty in that it does not annul the legal force of the war declaration. So that war authority remains and could be resumed in certain circumstances. So one of the mildly dramatic consequences of my theory is that because an executive agreement cannot change domestic law, including a war declaration, that by concluding an executive agreement ending a war, it does not legally end the war. The Afghanistan war could be, as an aspect of the authorization for the use of military force of September 18th, 2001, could be resumed by a subsequent president if circumstances indicated. Now, a further consequence of this position is that wars could become forever wars, right? That the president could conclude an executive agreement of peace, but it's never legally permanent and could be reopened at a subsequent time. That is disturbing in some circumstances, but I think that's actually the correct legal analysis. A side question that I bracket and leave out of most of the discussion in this version of the paper is whether Congress could pass a statute when it authorizes war, authorizing the president to terminate the war authorization by concluding an executive agreement. In other words, could Congress provide that its war authorization expires based upon presidential unilateral action? And I think, though I'm not clear on this, and I'd love your input on it, I think that the answer is yes. And I found one genuine example of that, which is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which actually provided that the resolution's legal force expired when the president determines that the peace and security of the area has been adequately preserved. So you have treaties, you have executive agreements. The third category of presidential peace powers is sort of ironic. I believe that the president's power as military commander-in-chief of the nation's forces in times of authorized war gives him the power to conclude peace, right? That the power of the president as military commander-in-chief, I take a very broad view of that the power includes the power to make all strategic and tactical military decisions, choice of attacks, choice of weaponry, choice of military tactics, including how far to go, and when to stop. That the power of commander-in-chief includes the power to conclude, determine that the force hostilities shall be at an end, that the war's objectives have been achieved, and that it's time to quit. The logic of that, I submit, is that the president has a corresponding power to refuse to fight at whatever given point the president thinks that fighting is not appropriate. So that the president could decline to execute what he thinks is an unwarranted war authorization by Congress. Now that's counterintuitive. In fact, I saw some eyebrows shoot up, just as I was describing that. But I actually think it flows from the understanding of the commander-in-chief power as one of complete discretion where Congress has authorized war as to the military conduct of the war. Now, if you combine these two in a section not written, I think the president has kind of this composite prospective peace power, literally the power to declare peace in advance, to say that there will be no war. And my paradigmatic historical illustration of that is George Washington's Neutrality Proclamation. Again, that's just not written yet in the paper. The second half of the paper, which is still very much on the drawing board, is congressional peace powers. And basically there are 3 or 4 of those too. Congress has the power to declare war, which includes the power to not declare war. The most straightforward peace power of Congress is the power not to authorize war in the first place. That gets us into the standard war powers debates as to the scope of the declare war clause power and its limitations on presidential unilateral military activity. And I'll be addressing some of that. I've addressed that in some of my other writing. Second peace power is the power to rescind or repeal a prior war authorization. The power can be exercised forward or power can be exercised backward. There have been a few instances where Congress has repealed a war declaration or war authorization. The most notable and interesting of those, and I'm still investigating this, is the repeal of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1971 during the midst of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War continued for several years after that, based on the asserted authority of continued appropriations and unilateral presidential military power. But it is an interesting illustration that if the power of Congress to authorize war is then repealed in a statute signed by the president or passed over his veto, that should end whatever authority flows from that authorization. The third congressional peace power, and this is still in the drafting board, is the appropriations power. The appropriations power is not a substantive war power, but it is a power to effectuate other powers. It is sort of Congress's shootout power, its ultimate trump card. And that is actually how the Vietnam War ended. Congress eventually, as it was continuing appropriations subsequent to the repeal of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, put a time limit. They passed an appropriations that said, but no further funds shall be expended for activities to support the war effort in Vietnam and Southeast Asia after, I believe the date was August 15th, 1973. And that's what effectively brought the war to an end. Then I will end by talking about war powers resolution. What is the scope of Congress's power to manage presidential activities that create situations that imply a prospect for military activities? So there's a lot of work to go on this. I would love to hear your comments and Michael's comments to talk me out of it if I'm mistaken, or to help me out and figure out what the answers are to some of these puzzles.